This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Desert locust swarms across the Horn of Africa attributed to climate change. We discuss the latest with experts. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. The year 2020 has already seen some of the world's biggest stories unfold, from the locust infestation in East Africa to the coronavirus outbreak in China and even bushfires in Australia. In today's Africa Live, we revisit some of the catastrophes that have made headlines this year. Well, we begin right here in East Africa, where a locust invasion has alarmed governments and communities. The locusts have destroyed farms and pastures in Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia and are now making their way into Uganda and South Sudan. Well, CGTN's Robert Nagila has been tracing their path of destruction and joins us for more here in our studios. Robert, of course, you've been covering the story of the locust infestation. It's beyond what many people can imagine, certainly something that Kenyans haven't seen in many, many decades. What have you personally observed over the past few months?
Well, Lindy, from what we've observed, they move with the direction of the wind. That seems to determine where they go and where they'll end up. Now, wherever they settle for the night, they seem to devastate the entire vegetation in their path. After that, then the breeding process, the mating begins. And once the adults then fly away, then these eggs that are hatched have another 3-month cycle before they hatch. And then the same cycle begins again over and over again.
Well, I know that, of course, as we said, you've been on the ground covering this. So let's take a look now at one of the reports that you've produced on this desert locust invasion.
The origin of the locust menace can be traced back to May and October 2018.
There have been 2 cyclones in the Indian Ocean, which could have contributed to creating conditions that are conducive for the breeding of locusts.
This created perfect conditions for breeding in the Rub al Khali Desert of Arabia, also known as the Empty Quarter, because it's extremely remote. A generation of breeding usually lasts about 3 months, and because of the heavy rains, at least 3 generations of breeding formed in a 9-month period. Once it dried out about a year ago, swarms began to form, with one portion moving north to the interior of Saudi Arabia, Iran, India and Pakistan. Another portion moved south into Yemen, where the current conflict did not allow for any control measures.
A single locust can travel 150 kilometers and eat its own weight in food, about 2 grams each day. A small swarm can consume the equivalent of food for 35,000 people in one day.
Here, the locusts began breeding. In June 2019, they began crossing into the Horn of Africa. By August, they had reached northeastern Ethiopia and parts of northwest Somalia. By October, the swarms had moved to the Ogaden Desert in eastern Ethiopia and into central Somalia, where again there was more breeding. Towards the end of 2019, they crossed into Kenya from Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. The locusts have now destroyed tens of thousands of hectares of vegetation in their wake, with experts warning of a real danger to food security in the region.
The size of these swarms are so huge that you need urgent action to prevent catastrophe.
By January 2020, over 2 million hectares of affected lands across their path had been treated over 18 months. In February, the locusts crossed into eastern Uganda and northern Tanzania and have now been sighted in southern Sudan. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
We're now joined by Dr. Stephen Njoka, Director, the Desert Locust Control Organization for Eastern Africa. Dr. Njoka, what is the state of locust infestation across the Horn of Africa?
Thank you. This is a very serious infestation and is unlike any other for the last 25 in Ethiopia and 70 years in Kenya. And I can say here the situation is so serious because the pests have now been reported in all the countries of the Horn of Africa, including Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and more importantly, in Somalia, where we believe there is a breeding ground for this.
Dr. Njoka, how are governments and organizations like yours dealing with the invasion, and what measures are working at this particular moment?
The governments of the region are working very hard on this pest. I would tell you that my organization, the Desert Locust Control Organization for Eastern Africa, have deployed 4 aircrafts in the region, 2 in Ethiopia and 2 in Kenya. And the governments themselves in Kenya have deployed, the Kenya government has deployed a further 2 aircrafts from the military and hired another 2 from the private sector. In Ethiopia here, similarly, besides the 2 aircrafts which my organization has deployed, the government of Ethiopia has also hired 3 more aircrafts to do control by spraying. We are using pesticides in the region, and we use what is called ultra-low volume pesticides, and that is what we are using to control these pests. So then we have had a lot of success, but the pest is serious because we continue to receive swarms from Somalia.
Now, so far, what has been destroyed and what kind of threat do the locusts pose?
So far, this pest, the locusts have destroyed hectares and hectares of crops, particularly the pastures, because luckily when the locusts came, most of the crops had been harvested, but the pastures are worst hit in southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. As they spread now to Uganda and South Sudan, we expect that they will cause more damage. But what we are doing as an organization and the government is to follow this pest and know where they are laying eggs so that we target the next stage of the insects, which we call hoppers. And by doing that, targeting the hoppers, we'll be controlling so that they don't mature into adults.
Interesting. And finally, Dr. Njoka, what do you think needs to be done to control this situation?
What needs to be done is and it's an appeal we keep making to the international community to come to our aid by increasing the capacity of the organization in terms of aircrafts and also in terms of pesticide supply to the region. Aircrafts, we need modern aircrafts like turbo thrush and air tractors, which have a higher carrying capacity of pesticides and even a long range when they are sent out to spray. So our appeal is particularly in those 2 areas, aircrafts and pesticide supply.
Absolutely. So clearly this crisis is still ongoing and a lot more still needs to be done, Lindy.
Absolutely. And what I found quite interesting there, what Dr. Njoka was saying, is that it has spread across the entire Horn of Africa. So it seems the problem is much bigger than we initially assessed. And just going back briefly, Robert, to what you saw and what you witnessed on the ground, how bad is the situation when you're confronted by it face to face? And in your opinion, from what you saw, are regional governments and international organizations doing enough to help?
Lindy, let me put it like this. The situation is really bad on the ground, especially for the small-scale farmers, because these are the ones that have been affected the most. You've got farmers who depend on their farms for their livelihoods, paying for their children's school fees, feeding their children and families. Most of their vegetation that they would have harvested and sold has all been devastated. They have no idea what to do at this particular moment. Now, in terms of regional governments, we have an early warning system. The United Nations had put out this warning much earlier, so we had time to prepare. Unfortunately, when the time arose, it found us unprepared. This is part of the problem. So that's the reason why we find ourselves in this crisis. What governments need to do in future is, because the early warning system is in place already, is to ensure that they're able to adapt to the situation as it arises, allocate funds early enough to be able to control the situations. At the moment, we have no idea as to when this crisis will be over.
And that's really a good point that you make there, that even though the systems are in place, the question comes down to the implementation of resilient strategies for those communities. Thank you so much to Robert Nagila joining us here in studio on that locust invasion in East Africa. Now, focusing closely on Kenya, those swarms of desert locusts continue to ravage the country's agricultural land. And for some farmers, as we've heard, their entire crop can disappear within just a matter of hours. Others have managed to salvage their harvest, and that's following government intervention. Once again, here's more from CGTN's Robert Nagila, this time bringing us a look at the situation in Tharaka Nithi County.
It's been a tough few days for 50-year-old father of 6, Benjamin Karugu. On Wednesday, a swarm of desert locusts invaded his 4-acre farm in eastern Kenya in the county of Tharaka Nithi, devouring everything in their path.
I'm still in shock. I have children in school and I depend on this farm for my livelihood. I am confused and I don't know what to do but pray to God.
His entire crop is gone.
I had planted millet, vegetables and beans.
It's a story replicated across much of the affected areas. Since early December, billions of locusts from Somalia and Ethiopia have destroyed tens of thousands of hectares of vegetation across Kenya, threatening the country's food security. All Benjamin can do now is wait for government assistance. But barely 10 kilometers away, the situation is different. Quick action by the government saved surrounding vegetation and crops. I find Japhet Mudengi on his farm harvesting his crop. Locusts invaded his farm last Saturday evening. But a day later, a government plane sprayed pesticides and got rid of them. The evidence scattered across his farm.
I farm on 3.5 acres, but they destroyed the crops on 2 acres.
He's among the lucky ones. He can still salvage a portion of his harvest. While it's still not clear how long it will take to end the locust plague, what is clear is that many will require assistance for the foreseeable future.
Crops
have been destroyed completely. Everyone here needs assistance. Fodder for cattle, goats, plus now many parents can't afford school fees. Their livelihoods is destroyed.
Authorities are yet to quantify the damage caused by the locusts. But already the Treasury has warned the invasion could have a negative impact on agricultural output, leading to higher inflation that could affect economic growth. And more misery is on the horizon. UN officials have warned that if the current outbreak is not brought under control soon, the number of locusts could grow 500 times by June. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Tharaka Nithi, Kenya.
Now, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization says the Horn of Africa region faces an unprecedented threat to food security and livelihoods. Swarms of locusts continue to increase in Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya. It is the worst locust invasion Somalia and Ethiopia have seen in 25 years. Meanwhile, the last time Kenya was affected with an infestation of this scale was 70 years ago. CGTN's Beryl Oro reports.
The plague of locusts has already caused extensive damage in several East African countries. In Kenya, the swarms have spread to 14 counties just kilometers away from neighboring Uganda and South Sudan. On Monday, a Ugandan government official said they had started spraying swarms of desert locusts that invaded the country over the weekend in a bid to tackle the major threat to livestock and key crops such as coffee. Somalia, on the other hand, is the first country in the region to declare a state of emergency over the infestation.
We were in Kenya 2 weeks ago. We have seen large swarms of locusts. For that, what we need to do is aerial spraying. What we saw here this morning is upper bands, so they are not flying yet. For that, we can do ground control operations. So there is a variety of tools that we have at our disposal to do these control operations. The problem we have in the region is that the The planting season will occur very soon. It will start April, May in most of the countries. It means that if we are not able to control locust population for the moment, there will be a huge impact on the forthcoming planting season.
Food crops and livestock forage in the three countries are being heavily impacted. The swarms are uncommonly large and can consume huge amounts of crops and forage. Across East Africa, 19 million people are already facing severe acute food insecurity, and experts have warned that this will get worse as this is a key season for pastoralists and farmers. FAO is raising funds and surging experts and supplies to affected countries to boost locust control measures. The FAO has appealed for $76 million to help combat the locusts, but says it has only received $19 million from donors so far.
It's time for the international community to understand that it is an issue that needs to be dealt with now. Otherwise, we will turn a situation of a plague. There will be high level of acute food insecurity. There will be million more people that will require food assistance, and it will take us years to control this situation.
The desert locust is the most dangerous migratory pest in the world. A locust swarm of 1 square kilometer can eat the same amount of food in one day as 35,000 people. Another round of locust breeding has now begun in all three most affected countries. Left unchecked and given the additional rain season expected, an enabler of desert locust reproduction, the scale of the upsurge could grow 500 times by June. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Well, it's not just East Africa that's currently affected by locusts. Earlier this month, Pakistan declared a national emergency over locust swarms. The country is now working with relevant agencies to curb the impact of locust attacks on agriculture and food security. Our correspondent Daniel Khan has more.
According to a preliminary assessment by the Agriculture Department of Sindh and Balochistan provinces, about 80,000 hectares of crop have been damaged, and there have been serious damages to grazing and forest lands. Now, according to the estimates of the Agriculture Department of Balochistan, the locust attack has caused over 4,600 million rupees worth of agriculture losses in the province alone. The affected crop area in Balochistan is around 45,000 hectares and has damaged crops that include wheat, mustard, barley, pulses, onions and cotton crops, among others. Experts say the most time-critical action now is to effectively eliminate adult locust in the already identified breeding zones to protect crops and livelihoods of poor farmers. Pakistan and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization have signed 2 agreements to control the locust attack with water management and farming practices that are resilient to climate change. The FAO has signed the Technical Cooperation Program with National Food Security and Research, under which FAO will make $700,000 available to Pakistan for the desert locust emergency measures. But the FAO says that the locust situation in Pakistan is so far under control, and if Pakistan can maintain this situation, it can prevent a bigger disaster in the future. Daniel Khan, CGTN, Islamabad.
Locust swarms in Africa and the coronavirus outbreak are world problems which should be addressed by the global community and not just by those directly affected. That's according to the Chinese head of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. But Chu Dongyu told CGTN's Martin Lowe that fears of famine from the locust invasion are premature. Let's listen in.
Causing great concern, clearly at the moment, are the huge locust swarms which are devastating crops in East Africa and now some parts of Asia. What can be done about that?
I think the locust issues is not new. Years come, but this is extremely bad since global warming and also special location with a special situation of natural meteorology disaster, and come the reality happening in East Africa, especially Kenya, it was not happening during past 70 years. And the rest, the Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, and Sudan, and now coming the border to the Uganda even. So FAO is always a professional organization to coordinate a global situation and early warning, early action. System is there. We have expert team every year to regularly monitor and surveillance what happening and go on. But this year, now it's just the end of the season, so there are a lot of locusts on the adult at the mating period. That will be disaster if we didn't take action now. After 1.5 months maximum, there will be 100, even 400 times more new larvae and new locusts. That time there will be created real disaster. So we ask the member countries, especially donor countries, to support it, to take early action to anticipatory action, and then we can prevent the next season when the farmers sowing seeds and the new leaves come on April or mid-April, and then we can break down the life cycle of the locusts.
Do you think famine, though, is a possibility this time?
No, not famine. But if we do take a concrete action now, we will prevent the disaster. So that's an anticipation action. If we didn't, there were not I would say farming, because it should be created serious international humanitarian crisis. And that's not only a question of the farming and the food, because there were in fact about 33 million people in that region. So that's why the UN headquarters and FAO myself, we take the early action during past 2 months with my teams there and also with local members.
Another major problem in the world at the moment, of course, is coronavirus, COVID-19. How can the FAO assist in that situation? And is there going to be an impact on things like food and animal exports around the world?
But for coronavirus, you know, it's one of the zoonotic disease. It's in fact the animal first and then come to the man. So that's why we are closely cooperation with WHO, because WHO is responsible for human disease mainly. But of course, due to the epidemic, serious situation, it's already infected farming, agriculture, livestock, and also domestic and international trade. I don't think coronavirus on food supply only limited on the certain epidemic area, like Wuhan and Hubei. That's my observation.
Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on this special edition of Africa Live. Coming up, China remains confident it will win the fight against the novel coronavirus. We bring you the very latest.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Well, let's turn our attention now to the coronavirus outbreak. The total number of confirmed cases in China has now surpassed 75,000, but more than 18,000 patients have recovered. COVID-19 has spread to 25 countries outside China. But just how did this epidemic begin? Let's take a look.
The epicenter of the outbreak is the Chinese city of Wuhan. COVID-19 has been traced back to a seafood and poultry market. The virus is suspected to have jumped from animal to human. China reported its first death in January as the virus spread to other provinces and other countries. By January 23rd, the entire city of Wuhan, with a population of over 10 million, was in lockdown. A week later, the World Health Organization declared the situation a global health emergency. COVID-19 is a respiratory illness caused by a particular strain of the coronavirus. Other strains include SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome. Cases were identified in 2002 in Asia. There's also MERS, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, with first cases reported in 2012 in Saudi Arabia. And now there's the latest strain of the coronavirus. In December 2019, Chinese health authorities began treating cases of pneumonia, back then of cause unknown. Chinese medical experts say COVID-19 is more contagious than either SARS or MERS. People may even be infectious before symptoms appear. According to the World Health Organization, the incubation period lasts up to 14 days. It seems to first present with a fever, followed by a dry cough. After a week, it leads to shortness of breath, and patients with severe symptoms may need to be hospitalized. There's treatment, but no cure yet, so it's up to the immune system to fight the virus. But experts around the world are working to develop a solution. The Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention says initial testing has begun for a candidate vaccine. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
Well, CGTN's Beatrice Marshall now joins me here in the studio to discuss the impact the coronavirus has had on Africa. Beatrice, 75,000 cases worldwide in 26 countries. But the big question is, how is Africa affected? Are there any confirmed cases at this stage?
Well, Lindy, let's start off with the fact that Africa is not new to outbreaks, and so African countries have been watching this very cautiously. There has so far not been any confirmed case on the continent. There was an Egyptian case that was, there were thoughts that perhaps one person in Egypt may have contracted the virus, but then the World Health Organization recently said that the test came back negative. So as we speak now, there is no confirmed case of coronavirus on the African continent, still coronavirus free. Africa has been watching this very closely. Of course, they understand that when an outbreak happens, it is not confined to one region. And the people I have been speaking to, and even I was speaking to at the African Union, they said, well, this is coming against the background of what we went through during Ebola, what we've gone through over the century, over the years, with polio outbreaks and so forth and so on, and even cholera outbreaks. And so they were like, we are watching this, but we know that this outbreak is going to be brought under control, because if we managed with Ebola, we believe that everything else will be brought under control, and that is how Africa is approaching the scenario.
And of course, as you say, Africa has adopted a couple of strategies which seemingly have worked well. These are including flights and such things, but we know that there's a great amount of air traffic between China and Africa. If it does reach the continent, is Africa prepared to deal with it?
First of all, Linda, let's look at how much travel there is between Africa and China. According to the African Union, over the last 10 years, flights between China and Africa have gone up exponentially to about 600%. So that is a huge number of people that keep going back and forth. Ethiopian Airlines is still flying to 5 regions in China as we speak. They did not stop their flights. African countries and the African CDC has said, African countries are quite prepared to deal with this. One, because African countries and the Africa CDC are in very close contact with their Chinese counterparts, who are also monitoring the situation. Secondly, we have to remember that African countries already had systems in place as a result of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and Ebola outbreaks that we've had since 1976. So in terms of at the airports, the temperature control procedures have always been there. We already had in African ports of entry, we had the temperature control as a result of the Ebola virus, and therefore, in terms of the checkups at the airports, that was already in control. Now, what we did not have labs to test for coronavirus because this was a new phenomenon, and up until until this month, we only had 2 laboratories, one in Senegal and one in South Africa, that was dealing with the entire continent. We now have up to 13 countries that are able to monitor that now have the laboratories to do that. And by the end of the month, which is next week, we expect to have up to 36 countries that are well furnished. And with that as well, the World Health Organization is setting up another 29 units. So in terms of testing and monitoring, the continent is very much up to speed in terms of that. But let's hear about what else is happening. And I just wanted to also mention, Lindy, that the African Union as well is having a ministerial meeting of African ministers that will be meeting at the African headquarters in Addis Ababa tomorrow to come up with strategies to deal with the coronavirus and how to continue with the monitoring and the testing. Well, CGTN's Africa senior editor joined a panel discussion on Switch TV's debut of a new talk show called The Tipping Point. During the show, Douglas Okwach spoke about China's latest efforts in fighting the novel coronavirus outbreak. And in the conversation with anchors and other guests, Douglas Okwach also shared views on Africa's readiness to prevent the spread of the outbreak on the continent. Interestingly, the discussion turned into a heated debate. Have a listen.
We need to begin looking at the post-coronavirus situation.
Yes.
Because we, like I already stated, and like many other people are saying, is that now we are beginning to see the whole situation regressing. It's getting lower. So Egypt Air will be going. There are calls on Kenya Airways to resume flights. We all know that Ethiopian Airlines did not stop flying to China. In fact, they continued flying to those five destinations. And China itself is doing a lot to kickstart the economy, because, you know, when we are talking about is Kenya ready, for example, the key questions we should be asking ourselves is, why are we not ready? And why does China have the capacity to deal with the disease? For example, all entry points to the country now have the ability, have the equipment to screen, so that we do not have cases of people walking in either through the airport or other ports of entry into the country without being screened. So that at least gives us confidence and a peace of mind that we are safe up to that point. One of the things that we need to reflect on is that a situation like this is an opportunity for a lot of myths, a lot of fake news, a lot of disinformation, particularly in the age of social media. So some of these myths, some of this disinformation, some of these statements that are not factual are actually going around in social media. And what this is doing is creating fear and panic. So I think information, particularly us as media people, should only be sourced from credible sources. Let's get information from credible sources. Let's corroborate that information. Let's verify that information before we disseminate it.
Now, because you have allowed me to make a statement, I will not go to the nitty-gritties, but I want to agree with Douglas and what you guys are saying and the caller. But I read the geopolitics of war and trade war in the issue of coronavirus in China. The geopolitics of war. And first of all, I want to advise the Chinese, I hope this will get to them, to stop eating anything that moves. You cannot eat anything that moves, including rats and everything. But you expect not to get these things.
Do you think as Africans we've been made to think they're eating these things that sometimes the evidence and the fact to show that they've been eating this thing, do you think is out here? Or
if you
we are
visit
surviving
China,
with stereotypes and minds.
if you visit China, if you pay a visit to China, you'll be served in a Chinese restaurant some snake soups. You'll be served something like rat soup.
So it's your public service announcement to China to stop eating anything that moves.
Excuse me, if you may allow me to jump in there, I think you started off very well with the geopolitics.
That's why I was headed there.
And for me, the geopolitics lies more in trade wars.
That's what I wanted to address.
And I think what we see happening in the U.S. at the moment is a country that is slowly extricating himself from the rest of the global world.
Yes.
What we see happening in Europe, particularly with Britain and Brexit, is a country that is trying to pull out of a common bloc from other countries. So what Africa in general is faced with is a situation of isolation. So Africa at this point in time should also find out who its true friends are. Our true friends, we know where they are.
The Chinese.
China are among our true friends.
I don't think they are our true friends, but we should not get into that discussion.
I think
At
one,
the
of,
government
the, one of
expense.
the countries that has intervened in Africa, look at the Ebola situation. Which country risked, which country made sacrifices to help Africa? I think it was China. Which other country did that other than China? That is why, you know, in times of difficulties like this, you know your true friends and you know those that are not your true friends.
Maybe I know he's from CGTN.
Yes.
So I know.
So he could be pro socialism and communism.
It's okay.
Yes.
But again, you see, let's go back to the evidence whereby these guys are eating anything that moves. You know, that's a damning report. But still, we're in African society. Stereotypes and so many things we believe in.
Do you know why I'm saying that? And the reason why I mentioned geopolitics of war. Today, we are having Chinese export to us fake fish that we are eating and flooding and killing the plastic is rice. But fish that is coming from China is basically being brewed along as it is coming from the shoreline to Mombasa. It is killing the local industry in Lake Victoria and wherever we are bringing fish.
I think instead of focusing on sideshows, on issues that are not very useful, I think we need to focus more on our state of preparedness. And I think the African Union and its Agenda 2063, has got all that laid out. For example, there's a plan for Africa's own CDCs. You know, surveillance is a key thing in dealing with epidemics like this. It's about pinpointing and telling that an epidemic is on the way so that it doesn't surprise you. Now, if that epidemic does happen, the second step and the importance of surveillance is making sure that we are prepared. Okay, now that it has broken out, how do we deal with it? Where are the resources? Where are the personnel? What do we need? Who can help us?
Manpower.
So I think those are the issues we need to focus on. And there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from China, looking at how they have dealt with the coronavirus, that we can also emulate.
Yes,
as Africa.
Briefly before we wind up.
Let me just get the last word in this way that I want to agree with Douglas. And maybe it is time as a country we start moving into terms of percentages in spending in percentages in every sector in our country. If it's about education, we set aside maybe 20% of the budget. If it's health, we say it is a particular percentage. So that the budget progressively increases in terms of percentage in each and every sector. So that if there is spending needs to be done, it must be spent in the right way, to the right reasons, or to the right purposes. And as he's talking about the state of preparedness, we need just to in every crisis, there is a silver lining. We need to learn something from that.
Well, Beatrice, that was indeed a very heated debate there on
Very
Switch
heated
TV.
indeed, yeah.
And it seems that what it raises for me is the amount of speculation that seems to be circling around coronavirus, whether it's about what Chinese people eat or whether it's about the validity of the statistics or information coming from China. How, in your view, do you think China has handled this question of misinformation during this outbreak?
So this is what we've been discussing over the last few weeks, is the growth of the digital media and how everybody is some sort of reporter in their own right, you know. There's a lot of, by the time information gets to point A and point B, particularly through the social media networks, sometimes the story is not what it originally was, right? And so we've been saying it is important that we get the facts, the correct facts, scientific data. It is all available. The Chinese authorities have been extremely transparent in how they have handled the coronavirus outbreak. For instance, at the very beginning, when they realized that there was a new strain of corona, they involved the WHO. The World Health Organization went into China, realized what was going on, and started the research, right? Called together some 300 scientists who then started researching what the new strain was, and so forth. So on that platform, there is a lot of information that you can gather if need be, and then even step by step, right? There have been daily updates from Chinese health authorities, daily updates from Chinese government on exactly what the government is doing to control the outbreak. And even the World Health Organization last week said this is no longer a global, it's not a global pandemic, epidemic. So there's a lot of different strategies that the Chinese government has undertaken to ensure that the outbreak is brought under control. That is the story that needs to come out, not a lot of scaremongering and so forth. Because if you look at some statistics, for instance, right, coming out of the Center for Disease Control in the US, where it talks about influenza in the US, how many people are affected every year? Between 140,000 to 810,000 are hospitalized every year because of influenza, right? So sometimes we have some people have tended to blow what is happening in China out of control, out of control, and yet there is a lot of efforts that has gone into controlling the outbreak. China built a hospital in less than a week, right? A second hospital shortly after. 11 temporary hospitals have been set up in Wuhan alone to try and control the epidemic. So there has been a little bit of misinformation, but I think when you look at the African scenario, where the people that have been that have assisted in ensuring that there isn't so much panic have been our government officials, because when it comes to telling the people what exactly is happening in terms of the epidemic, you hear that it is the ministers of health in government. You hear that our ambassador in China has talked about it. So it is high-level officials that have responded to the outbreak, and therefore made sure that on the African continent, at least there is as little panic as possible in there.
And that information is key, isn't it? That's what's going to keep people safe at the end of the day. Well, thank you so much to Beatrice Marshall joining us here in studio and a look at how the coronavirus has impacted Africa. Well, time now for a short break. Still more coming up on this special edition of Africa Live. Up next, Australia contains fires for the first time in nearly 6 months. Heavy rains help firefighters take control of fires that have raged across Australia since September. The wildfires that devastated large parts of Australia have largely been contained. The scale of destruction is now being assessed. And as we look back at this dark chapter in many Australians' lives, let's take a look at how and where it all started.
Bushfires are a common seasonal occurrence in many parts of eastern Australia. In fact, many tree species, especially the eucalyptus, have adopted well to this phenomenon. Local population have also crafted their lifestyle to reflect on dry seasons and wildfires that happen so often. But the current fire season has left many locals questioning the impact of climate change and the government's commitment in tackling it. This season's bushfire was preceded by a remarkably drier season than usual. The wildfires kicked in September 2019 in southeastern Australia. Most affected regions include those in the state of New South Wales, among others. Sydney's Blue Mountains, Hunter Region, Hawkesbury and Southern Highlands and many more regions have not been spared. In the eastern and northeastern Victoria, large fires raged out of control, leaving death and destruction in their wake. In South Australia, southeastern Queensland and the western parts have not been spared. A state of emergency has since been declared in the capital, Canberra. Countries from far and wide have since joined in the fight against the blazes. Floods occasioned by the opening of the skies have eased the situation, but it's not over yet. Questions on the government's commitment to control these fires abound. Many have been blaming the government for being oblivious of the effects of climate change. The government has also come under fire over the handling of emergency response operations. Currently, 34 lives have been lost, over 500 million animals dead, all in over 18 million hectares of destroyed land. The situation is now being blamed on climate change, the positive Indian Ocean dip hole, and drought. As vast parts of Australia lie in ruins, locals now look back and seek solace in the unity of loss. For in this, they are one: humans, trees, and animals. Jane Keo, CGTN.
Now, Australia was already grappling with extreme heat before the devastating bushfires tore through the country's bone-dry land. So how bad are bushfires? Our correspondent Greg Navarro tells us more.
To get a sense of why Australia's bushfires have been so bad this time around and so unprecedented, all you have to do is look down at the ground. Basically, whatever you find is extremely dry. That's the result of a drought now covering 3 states, including virtually all of New South Wales here, making conditions over 3 years extremely dry. Another factor has been the heat. Australia experienced its hottest year on record in 2019, and the 2 years before that were hotter than normal as well. And 2019 was the country's driest year ever, with rainfall at about 40% below the average. Scientists believe weather patterns have also played a role in generating extreme conditions. That includes the impact of the Indian Ocean dipole, which, simply put, tends to draw moisture away from Australia and leads to less rainfall. And then there are the impacts from climate change. Climate scientists have been warning for years now that a warming planet means that weather extremes will become more extreme and more frequent. And as far as Australia is concerned, that bushfire seasons here will become longer. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Well, let's head back to Africa now, where extreme weather events have been occurring at an unprecedented and accelerated pace. CGTN's Daniel Arapmoy takes a look at the continent's natural disaster hotspots.
Africa is often facing recurring emergencies aggravated by extreme weather. In fact, nowhere else in the world are communities more at risk than on this continent. Let's take a look at some of the devastating environmental hotspots on the continent. Southern Africa, which is on the front line of the global climate crisis, has been buffeted by back-to-back shocks with erratic and uneven rainfall, causing both floods and drought. A further increase in locust swarms is likely to continue until about June due to the continuation of favorable ecological conditions for breeding. Cyclone winds and floods that swept across southern Africa affected more than 2.6 million people and could rank as one of the worst weather-related disasters recorded in the southern hemisphere. Between 75 and 250 million people in Africa are projected to be exposed to increased water stress due to climate change. In the same year, in some countries, yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%. And that's a brief look at Africa's environmental hotspots. Back to you.
Well, for more on how climate change is affecting Africa, we're now joined here in our Nairobi studio by Kenneth Mwangi. He is a satellite data analyst with the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center. Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to ask you what the impact of climate change on the continent is, but of course we've been talking about locust invasions and extreme weather. Essentially, are we already seeing it now, the impact of climate change in Africa?
Well, thank you very much. It's very clear on livelihoods, on people's lives, the impacts of climate change. For example, just to bring last year was a perfect year of climatic extremes. It's 1 year that we had droughts at the beginning of the year in this region, not just in Kenya, but this is Eastern Africa and up to maybe Southern Africa. We've had droughts and we've had floods in the same year. Indeed. And then after that, we are seeing cyclones, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. Also, we are seeing 2 cyclones that affected Mozambique in a span of 5 weeks. That's very unusual and very strange. And we can see a strong cyclone that landed in the coast of Somalia. and which is very strange for that time of the year. And the magnitude of the cyclones are becoming stronger also. So evidently from data, from humanitarian impact, we are seeing climate change affecting lives, and it's very evident now, more than any other time.
If the evidence is just really something we can't ignore anymore, do you think African governments are responding accordingly?
Well, African governments, I think it's still a shocker to them because they've never been incorporating climate change into their national budgets. But suddenly now they have to. We are finding some governments are faster in that, while others not. And there's a limit on resources now that they've not been focusing resources in mitigating climate change, but now they have to. The response from African governments is still very low, considering we are the most affected because we don't have the shocks in terms of financial shocks to absorb the impacts of climate change. So we are not doing very well as African countries, but we need to do really a lot more.
So then what are the tools available to us, or what are these strategies we need to adopt in order to help Africa mitigate against these climate disasters?
Well, the tools that we need to tap into is global tools that are now designed to help countries mitigate the impacts of climate change, like they're financing global climate fund that countries can bring down to national climate funds and incorporate it into their treasury that in the development plans that are happening. We are among the fastest growing economies in the world in Africa now. So we can take advantage of that to focus foreign direct investments or even our own investments as countries into green technology, green energy, nature-based solutions, and technological solutions. So that's the advantages we can take as African countries.
And what does the data tell you about what the future looks like for Africa as far as climate change is concerned? Is it going to get worse from here on?
Oh yes, it can get really worse. Already these cyclones we are talking about, 8 cyclones in 1 year, is the effect of 1 degree change.
Sure.
And the Indian Ocean itself has warmed, Western Indian Ocean close to Africa now, African coast, Eastern African coast all the way to the south. We can see it, according to the data, warmed most than even Eastern Indian Ocean. So already data is showing 1 degree change has brought so much impact in terms of drought and floods, impact on economies. We've had growth revised downwards for many countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia already due to climatic shocks. So it can be worse because if there are no interventions, it can even go to 4 degrees. So 1 degree causes 8 cyclones in a year. So imagine if we went to 4 degrees, the worst case scenario that scientists say if we don't take adequate measures, it can get into.
That's very worrying indeed.
It's very worrying.
Thank you so much, Kenneth Mwangi, joining us here in our Nairobi studio on the potentially very worrying impact that climate change could have here in Africa. Let's turn to Zimbabwe now. Unrelenting power cuts are forcing businesses to rethink the way they operate. Many have been forced to work at night when electricity is available or spend money on fuel to power their generators. CGTN's Farai Makutuya has more on Zimbabwe's energy crisis.
After a severe drought in 2018-2019 reduced water levels at Kariba Dam, Zimbabwe's main power generation plant, businesses here were plunged into darkness. Rolling power cuts running into 18 hours per day have cut output and are hurting bottom lines, according to a survey done by the Zimbabwe Chamber of Commerce.
We found that the majority of them are losing productivity and losing productive time. Productive output and productive time are being lost to the tune of 50% because of that inadequate power. Businesses on average are using at least 22 liters of fuel per day. And you can appreciate with the appreciation of the fuel price that's been happening of late, how those costs are escalating. And also generators are a very inefficient way of powering businesses.
Generators also emit carbons whose harm to the environment is blamed for causing the erratic weather that's shrunk water levels at Kariba Dam and is also threatening Zimbabwe's other main water assets. The Victoria Falls was recently the subject of intense speculation on whether the falling voluminous deluge of water is drying up. Tourist bookings on which the town, named after the falls, survives, took a knock after the adverse media, which industry players have refuted.
The main parts of the Victoria Falls, where you've always viewed the Victoria Falls, have always remained with water. Yes, it is low because from the period of October to late January, you will always find that there's very low water within the falls. And then it picks up, but again, it does not substitute the fact that we do have an issue of climate as a globe, and it is not peculiar to Zimbabwe or Zambia or any other country for that matter. It is something that we have to deliberately work to alleviate by all means.
The sooner that's done, the better, especially as the climate change-induced effects threaten the very survival of many businesses here. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, a further consequence of climate change is that it has been driving up food prices across Africa, with longer droughts and floods devastating crop yields. Farmers are also struggling to time their planting windows as seasonal rains become increasingly erratic. Here's Daniel Arap Moy once again on the effects of these changing weather patterns.
Agriculture in Africa is fast becoming highly sensitive to climate variability and weather extremes such as droughts, floods, and severe storms. Recent research by the Institute of Development Studies suggests a strong upward trend in world market prices of the main traded staple crops over the next 20 years, with a significant portion of the increase caused by climate change. Mbithi is one among hundreds of thousands of farmers across Africa who are struggling with the unpredictable weather pattern caused by climate change.
Out of all this erratic climate that is happening, we are forced to delay things, and also affecting our production, which by now we had anticipated from January we'll be having bumper harvests, but we cannot have that.
The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization also projects agricultural price increases as a result of climate change and population growth in combination with low agricultural productivity growth.
According to FAO, latest figures on the state of global food security and nutrition, nearly 256 million people on the African continent suffer from severe food insecurity. Hunger is on the rise, with 20% of population suffering from undernourishment.
But the continent has also made some progress in continental frameworks aimed at fostering sustainable development in all its forms, including sustainable forest management in Africa's blue economy.
Africa therefore needs practical adaptation measures to safeguard our people and ensure that they are safe from the negative impacts of climate change. We need to continue building our capacity to manage climate change-related disasters.
But an area that remains underexplored is the potential impact of climate change on food price volatility. That is, the nature of food price fluctuations around the long-run trends that will result from the predicted increases in extreme weather events in the future. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
And indeed, from what we've seen across the world and here in Africa, climate change directly impacts nature and all humans. Communities around the world have been forced to deal with the severe impacts of climate change. Humans, by their nature, have dominated the planet, but it would appear that people have largely viewed nature as something to be exploited. Thus, nature has been treated as a commodity that exists for the benefit of people. And so, devising a new world order will require us to develop a more caring relationship with the earth, the need to protect nature by promoting sustainable development. And this will help ensure harmony between humans and nature. And to do this, we must remember that change starts with the individual, with each and every one of us. Well, thanks so much for watching today's special edition of Africa Live. We do value your feedback, so send your thoughts on the issues covered today to us on the details on your screen, and also do follow us on digital media. From me and the team here in Nairobi, thanks for watching and take care.